Hello everyone, I'm Anne-Marie Robinson. I'm Principal Policy Officer in the GLA's climate team. In today's webinar, I will be talking through London's climate aims, the background to the whole life cycle carbon emissions policy. I'll also provide an outline of the guidance and how to submit a whole life cycle carbon assessment before handing over to Chen Li from Cundall, who will talk through the assessment template and how we expect applicants to comply with the policy. Cundall, along with Targeting Zero, were appointed by the GLA to provide technical advice and support in the development of the whole life cycle carbon guidance document, and also helped draw together views and feedback from industry through our stakeholder engagement activity with developers, architects, engineers and consultants, among others. We'll spend around 25 minutes presenting before we open up to questions. The Mayor has an ambitious climate agenda and wants London to be a net zero carbon city by 2030, with clean transport, efficient buildings and a clean energy supply. We've published a 1.5 degrees C climate action plan to support this, which is compatible with the Paris Agreement. We are also aiming to be a zero waste city, have the best air quality of any major city, and increase green cover by 50%. Our approach to achieving these aims is set out in London's first integrated environment strategy, and there are also a number of programmes supporting these aims and published action plans, including those on fuel poverty and on solar. The London Plan is an important tool in the work we are undertaking to respond to the climate emergency, and the whole life cycle carbon policy and guidance represents a step change in how we ensure the planning system plays its role in meeting our net zero carbon target alongside the new Be Seen energy monitoring policy. This is a reminder of the whole life cycle carbon policy wording set out in policy SI2DB, which requires all referable developments carbon emissions through a nationally recognised assessment and demonstrate actions to reduce whole life cycle carbon emissions. For the first time, we are requiring planning applications which are referred to the Mayor to calculate and reduce embodied carbon. This is in addition to calculating and reducing operational carbon emissions as part of a whole life cycle carbon approach. We weren't attempting to reinvent an assessment process with our guidance. There are British standards and the Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors guidance, both of which our approach stems from and which applicants are expected to comply with, although there are a couple of instances where we've diverged slightly from the RICS guidance and which we'll touch on later. What the GLA guidance does is to set out how to comply with the London Plan policy, what information applicants need to provide, and how and when we'll assess them. The document also links to the new circular economy statement guidance, for which there are separate webinars being held later this month and in December, which you can find on our website. There are synergies between these two policy areas, which we've outlined in the guidance, and that's really to prevent any duplication of effort on the applicant's part. The building and construction sector globally is responsible for 39% of carbon emissions, with 28% coming from the energy needed to heat, cool and power them, and 11% from materials and construction. With the building stock expected to double globally by 2050, there's a real need to fully capture the carbon footprint of what we're building, from the emissions associated with extracting materials through to what happens at the end of a building's lifetime. Operational carbon emissions will make up a declining proportion of a development's whole life cycle carbon emissions as operational carbon targets become more stringent. The diagram here shows how significant the embodied carbon of a building can be, with the green segments representing embodied carbon emissions compared to the light grey segment, which represents the operational emissions. There's a wide range of activity going on to establish standardised methods and approaches to assessing whole life cycle carbon, and this form of carbon assessment is increasing in prominence in discussions around how we get to net zero, from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors guidance to various developers who are undertaking embodied carbon assessments as part of their core business, to the international networks that we're a part of, including the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, who are developing tools to help cities identify these emissions that aren't typically captured. And we also have the Committee on Climate Change, who've been calling on government to establish a framework to assess whole life cycle carbon emissions. Our policy in London really contributes to this growing prominence of this form of assessment to really ensure that London is accounting for the embodied carbon of its buildings as well as the operational carbon as part of a whole life cycle carbon approach. And there are a number of outcomes we're trying to achieve, including getting developers to think more consistently and comprehensively about this form of assessment, so it really does inform building design. Also encouraging the reuse of existing materials, the retrofit retention of existing structures and fabric, as well as encouraging more durable construction and flexible design for greater building longevity. Our definition of whole life cycle carbon emissions is represented in this diagram. It covers the extraction of raw materials, the manufacture and transportation of materials to site, on-site construction, as well as operational emissions. And for the operational emissions segment, the energy assessment guidance still applies here in terms of how to calculate operational emissions. And again, to avoid duplication of effort, the operational emission figures calculated as part of an applicant's energy strategy are lifted and essentially dropped into the whole life cycle carbon assessment, which is explained further in the guidance and also links to the requirements under the BC energy monitoring policy. Then we have the emissions from maintenance of the building, repair and replacement, and finally dismantling, demolition and eventual material disposal, and it's this element which primarily links to the circular economy statement. The Mayor's net zero carbon target continues to be based on operational regulated emissions, and so it's not a whole life cycle carbon target. Through research, discussions and evidence from stakeholders that came through the London Plan consultation, it emerged that we don't have a solid enough basis to set a meaningful whole life cycle carbon target yet. There isn't enough consistent and comprehensive enough data and approaches to do that, but the inclusion of the whole life cycle carbon policy in the London Plan and the guidance that we've developed really sets us in that direction so we can get a better understanding of what good practice looks like. So while there aren't policy targets on whole life cycle carbon, part of Cundall's work for us was to consider whether we could set benchmarks that could be used to compare whole life cycle carbon assessments with when they're submitted to us. Appendix 2 is how the benchmarks are together, with an example given here for offices. And these benchmarks are based on assessments of projects carried out by Cundall in Targeting Zero and cross-referenced with data provided by eTool and OneClick, among others. We provided benchmarks for, as well as offices, retail, apartments, hotels, and educational uses. There are two sets of benchmarks, the first based on those project assessments, and the second are a set of aspirational benchmarks, which take the first set of benchmarks and apply the World Green Building Council's target of a 40% reduction in whole life cycle carbon emissions by 2030. Applicants will be required to compare their whole life cycle carbon assessments against these benchmarks, provide explanation if and when they differ, and we'll be doing scrutiny against those. This is a brief outline of the guidance and what it includes. It introduces the policy, its aims and benefits, as well as the links to the net zero target. The chapter on process and methodology explains when to submit a whole life cycle assessment. It sets out the life cycle modules, as well as acceptable sources of carbon data. It also covers the content of a whole life cycle assessment, what information should be included at each stage and how we'll scrutinise them. And finally, the appendices. The Appendix 1 outlines the software tools that may be used, although this is not exhaustive. Appendix 2 provides the benchmarks, and Appendix 3 gives a list of further guidance materials that will be helpful for applicants. There are a few key points to note in how to submit a whole life cycle carbon assessment. Planning applicants will be required to submit the GLA's whole life cycle carbon assessment template at pre-app stage, at stage 1 submission, and at post-construction. The template should be submitted in Excel, not as a PDF, and the post-construction assessment will be conditioned by local boroughs. As I've mentioned, the statement in policy SI7 will feed into the whole life cycle assessment, and there are links to the energy assessment guidance and the BC energy monitoring guidance. I'll now hand over to Chen to talk through the assessment template and the information required at each stage.
Thanks, Emery. Thanks for the introduction. And hi, my name is Chen Li, from a principal engineer from Cundall. We're part of the team who produced this guidance, especially also set up the policy and the benchmarks. And as part of the process, and Emery explained, we have developed a whole life carbon template, which the applicant could use at various application stages, basically the pre-application, outline, and detail stages, and also the post-construction stage. At pre-application stage, we have developed about 20-ish questions, and mostly yes and no questions. People can define and answer. This is basically covers the early design decisions that could be beneficial for the project. And also we ask them to provide guidance answers and explanations of the source behind this, provide some additional information. And when you submit or move on to the outline planning stage, we'll be asking for more detailed information such as site opportunity and site constraints, and so people could provide the detail of the assessment itself. And also we ask people to provide information on actions already taken that have been reduced embodied carbon at this stage, and also any further opportunities you are expected to explore and you're expected to employ during the further design development stage that could reduce the embodied carbon or whole life cycle carbon of your project. We have produced in each application stage, apart from pre-app, we have developed a Excel template that breaks down embodied carbon of each building component. It's either kilogram of CO2 the total and or kg CO2 per square meter. And the purpose of this template is for people to provide detailed breakdown of the assessment result. This is for the energy officers who assess the result easier to identify the accuracy and the completeness of the assessment. And also when we compare this against other benchmarks and other schemes, people can make a more informed comparison because this provides a better breakdown of the data. And also in the outline planning stage, when there's less information is available of your product, you could refer to the RSS guidance, professional statement on material default selections in the material choices and transportation choices and also lifespan choices. In detailed planning stage, again, we require similar level of information, but for materials and lifespan and specification, we would expect you to have more of that available at this stage. So we expect you to use more precise project material and lifespan information to generate the result. And also, but again, for anything that still you don't have at this stage, you can refer to the RSS document as a guidance. The information you provided at either outline planning stage and detail planning stage will be used as baseline. And again, those will be the ones compared against the whole life carbon benchmarks we developed in this guidance. And also we expect you to explain and provide explanation if there are discrepancies between your result and the benchmarks. It might be the site is difficult, or maybe there's constraint on the site. It limits you from using some of the reduction options. And also we would like to see your commitment on how to further reduce this whole life carbon further. And one of the key requirement of this as part of the planning condition would be you are required to produce a post-completion whole life carbon update. And this need to be submitted within 3 months of practical completion. And you need to update the calculation submitted before using the actual material specification used for the project, and also the actual emissions from site work, transportation, and any waste generated during construction. This way, we can this is going to be quite valuable, not for for GLA, and also for the industry to get knowledge of how actual data is in terms of building whole life carbon, or in this case, upfront embodied carbon is calculated, how this can be delivered, and what are there any gaps of prediction and actual submission. And also when you submit this data, if that difference drastically from what you have previously submitted, you are required to provide explanation and also lessons learned, what have gone wrong or what have gone well in terms of during construction, and what could have been done in the next project of similar type. And as I said, you compare this against the benchmarks and you submit it in the previous stage. Okay, which is not, I don't think you'll be hold against what you submitted before, but in this, the purpose of this to ask people to be more aware of the information they provide, and also you get better and better going forward how this data can be used and how you run assessment at the beginning and how you implement a proper reduction options at different stage to make sure they are delivering the best benefit. And also in here, we mentioned assessment 1. We also asked them to all the applicants to do assessment 2, which takes consideration of grid decarbonization published by the government. This not only applies to operational emission, also we expect you to apply this to material emission as well. Again, we will explain how we have explained how we want this to be implemented in the guidance, and we might also explain it a bit further when we have a Q&A later on. So the application will be passed on to energy officers to review at various stages. And what we hope to review data against, what we'll be reviewing data against is you review the data against the completeness and technical quality and the reductions you achieved, and also the ambitions set out. Of course, at pre-application stage, we could only check initial commitment and how detailed the commitment could be, and how ambitious we think those targets or reductions commitment you set out. And in the outline and detail application, we will review data more rigorously, and also we will be looking at the material quantity submitted, and also how is that representative of a project this type, or are there any mistakes or omissions in this submitted. This way we'll get a more precise picture of the design, and also this way we can make sure people are accounting the full scope of the emission of the buildings. And at post-completion, you will provide, we'll ask you to, as I said, you'll be asked to provide as-built material quantities and specification. And you will check what reductions actually achieved, the reduction ambition you set out at early stage, are they actually delivered? If not, what's the reason? And if it's yes, is there something we can build up on for future projects? For example, this is one of the example we received during this consultation process about this is early stage of outline planning application submission. What we did, we looked at what in terms of the questions they answered, and then we can comment on some of them. Is actually are they actually business case or just business sense of doing things the right way, or actually they challenge themselves doing something more ambitious. For example, they declare they're going to use 50% GGBS, which is good. We like the precise targets, and also if say they only reuse sub-base from the demolition waste, this is not something that innovative. Also, it's not something we qualifies for reuse of structures. Okay, things like this will pick up and will comment, and that's will hopefully we'll have a dialogue with the design and the applicant to drive this bit further. During the outline or detailed planning stage, okay, we'll be reviewing the data a bit more rigorously, and also you will be asked to provide more information to us. For example, in this case, the assessment does only follow the RSS minimum requirement. But again, as Emery said, the GLA requirement is actually more rigorous than the minimum requirement for the RSCS. We actually ask them to provide more information than minimum. And also, for example, when we look at the data submitted to us, we realize the facade only shows a float glass single pane, which clearly is not representing for the building of this type, not curtain walling type. And also, they have not provided material quantities, which is crucial for the energy officers who will be assessing the completeness of the assessment to make sure that actual data makes sense. And also quite interesting, when they summarize the data, the waterproofing membrane is actually embodied carbon is more than all the steel decking and reinforcement. But that doesn't normally make sense. I'm not saying it could be a mistake of the data. That's something again the algorithm will pick up or challenge back for them to check the model to make sure that they actually represent reality. So in summary, we'll require a template in Excel form, which is really important. Otherwise, people could not search, could not check and compare against each other. And also, we'll need the material quantity to be provided to allow energy officers to check whether the whole life carbon figures seem appropriate. And the quantity of material estimated to be reused, recycled. Again, this links directly with the circular economy policy. You are required to submit that for circular economy assessment. And we just need the same document, same data to be provided here as well. And also, we'd like to see clear ambitions of reducing whole life carbon. This is not only a accounting exercise. We'd like to see more ambitious targets and reductions being tried from those applications. So, as part of the consultation process, we have been receiving a few questions so far, and also in the Q&A, I think we'll address some of them. Again, all the questions we'll have opportunity to address more formally during the consultation process. But again, just to pick up a few key things, embodied carbon of MEP component, how people calculate it. They made reference, say, in the guidance, say, at the time of producing the guidance, there wasn't a key guidance published. But recently, our CIPC have published a guidance on how to calculate MEP component whole life carbon. Again, we'll be referring to that in our update. And also how to calculate decarbonization of not only the energy and also the materials. Again, that's something people have been interested in, who will probably provide more insight to that. And also there's a few other areas we'll hope to address. Again, we'll cover this more in the Q&A session. Okay, now I'll hand over back to Anne-Marie for the closing statement.
Thanks, Chen, and thanks everyone for listening today. On this final slide, we've shared a link to the consultation survey, which should be submitted by the 15th of January, and a dedicated email, which you can use to ask us questions about the guidance, as well as a more general inbox and phone number to use for more general questions concerning the consultation process. You can also follow us on Twitter, sign up to the GLA planning newsletter, and there's also a link to the other guidance documents that are being consulted on at the moment, as well as a link to this presentation, which will be available following the webinar. Thanks again for listening.